everybody, happy Wax on Wednesday and happy Inktober. I thought it would be fun to do a video with some alcohol inks since it's October, Inktober, and I'm using the Pinata set today, and I have all the supplies I used listed today as usual on the blog, and that's on the sherryreplogle.com website, the whole blog post for this video, including all the supplies. So to sort of move the ink around in some different ways, I'm using a Catalyst Wedge number 6 today and also a rubber brayer. And that's just going to move the ink around and make some different marks, move it around in different ways, and kind of play with what the alcohol ink can do here. And one thing I will note is that it depends on when you fuse this, how that ink reacts. So if you fuse it when it's still wet, it's going to have that sort of burn effect, not quite a shellac, but it does move a little bit and it does catch a flame if you do it when it's very, very wet. And then if you let it dry for a minute, it will sort of stay as it is, just like an India ink does. It's sort of the same effect. So just give it a hot minute to dry there, and it'll stay the way you put it anyways. And if it'll have a more tendency to move or separate if you fuse it when it's still really, really wet. So it's fun to sort of play around with. I love moving the ink around with brayer, and it has a completely different effect if you use the Catalyst Wedge and move it around that way. I have a torch on a very, very, very low flame because I don't want to move that ink around too much. So you can see there that where the orange, where it was wet, it sort of separated, and that's because the ink was wet. So it's fun to play around with different effects and play around with fusing the ink when it's a little bit wet and see what it does, play around when it's dried and see what it does. Alcohol ink is just sort of fun to play around with. And the thing that I like to do with alcohol ink is make layers of it in the encaustic. So I love the way you can see it very boldly underneath those layers, just like India ink, and adding more additional clear layers of wax over the top of it and being able to see back down through all those layers are some of my favorite ways to play with any sort of ink and encaustic. And every time I add another layer of ink or another layer of clear wax over, I fuse the ink into the wax first, and then when I add the clear wax over, I fuse it again. And another thing is, if I did notice that, and I think you can see here in this layer a little bit, that if the brush is really, really hot and the panel is hot because it's been fused so many times so quickly, the ink will have, again, a tendency to move. So if you want to have, if you've made some interesting marks that you want to keep and retain with that ink, then a good idea, even if you've let it set, but your board is still hot because you fused it so much, especially on a small board. This is, I think, a 8x8, so it's pretty small. It retains heat for a while. So if you let it set out a little while until the ink is completely clear, and this is always when I recommend working on 3 or 4 pieces at a time, and that way each piece has a chance to rest a little bit and cool down while you're working on other pieces. And if you let it cool completely before you add that layer of clear wax over, then your ink should retain its marks. So if you're having problems with your ink moving around on you, and you have a great mark, and then you go to add a bunch of a layer of clear wax, and the ink moves, then try letting it rest until it's cool to the touch completely, the whole board. So if you touch the board, it's not warm at all, and then go ahead and add the layer of clear wax, and I think you'll find that your marks will stay. And there you can see that orange just went right away, and that's because the board overall was too warm. So if you let it cool down all the way, those ink marks are going to stay exactly as you put them. So it's a lot of fun to play around with these layers of ink and wax, especially when you can start to see down through the history of all those marks down through the layers of wax that you've made. One thing to note with alcohol ink is that alcohol ink is not archival. And I have had pieces that have faded over time, where certain pigments have faded to a completely different color over time, even when they've been embedded down in several layers of wax. So it's a lot of fun to play around with, but just keep in mind that alcohol ink is not archival, and that the wax covering will not protect it, will not protect those colors, that some colors just naturally are going to fade over time. So if you've used alcohol ink with encaustic, I would love to hear from you, and we'd all love to hear what your experience was. So feel free to leave a comment below on how your experience was with the alcohol ink and encaustic. I've never had an issue with the black, the white, or the gold alcohol inks. They've always stayed true for me. I'm taking a little bit of risk with that orange, but I'm going to see. I loved it so much that I'm going to see how this plays out if it stays. So I hope you really enjoyed this Wax on Wednesdays, and we will see you next week. Happy Wax on Wednesdays.